We have a concept here called ahika, which means keeping the fires burning. And so for Māori, to keep hold or keep sovereignty over a piece of land, you live on that land and, you occupy that land. And so the fact that the Jewish people have had a continuous presence in the land, even though they've been dispersed, even though they've been in exile, they've always been Jewish people there. For us, that's the Jewish people keeping ahika over that land, keeping sovereignty over that land, keeping the fires burning.
Welcome to Common Voices, a podcast brought to you by Avi, focused on bringing together individuals of all walks of life and all backgrounds and find our common ground and find what brings us together, especially in the context of Israel and the Jewish community and the war, I would say, on Western civilization, the cultural war especially that we're seeing so much today. And with us is our guest and an incredible ally and advocate and, dare I say, even friend, Dr. Sheree Trotter, head of the Indigenous Embassy of Jerusalem. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's good to see you again, Daniel. I have very fond memories of our first meeting 2 years ago in Toronto, where we had a series of events, that amazing Israel March, 50,000 people, and we were able to bring together an Indigenous group to come and support that and come to your office and receive your hospitality and met others. And so, yeah, it's great to reconnect.
Thank you. I look back on that day with such fondness. And it was such a phenomenal experience. And I think we've really been able to grow the relationship and do such incredible work together since then.
Absolutely. I mean, it was wonderful that we were able to have another delegation last year again, so that for 2 years in a row, we've had a delegation at that march, and we're looking to do it again, aren't we? So
yes, we are. Yes, we are. We won't give too much away. But it's very exciting, and I think, especially for members of the Jewish community and for Canadians more broadly, it's always surprising to them when I speak about the incredible support I've received, and the Jewish community I think has received in general, from various First Nations communities from across Canada. But not even across Canada, all over the world. For those who don't know, Sheree is joining me from New Zealand, while I'm here in Toronto. So no time difference, will take us apart.
Absolutely. We're in summer, you're in winter, but yeah.
But that aside, I don't know if you can see the snow and the winter from outside.
Oh, yes, wonderful.
So it's funny because obviously I think many people within the community and in the human rights space have become more and more familiar with the work that you are doing with Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem. But for those of our listeners today who have yet to hear about you and the work that you do, how would you describe the work that you're doing at Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem, and what gap would you say are you filling, that didn't exist before you launched just a few years ago?
Well, to simplify it, I would say that, there are two main things that we're working on to start with. I mean, we're very new, of course, and one is education and the other is community. And with education, because I've been involved in academia and I have recognized that a lot of the problems we're seeing, they start with academia and they filter out from there to politics, to media, to everyday people on the street, to social media. And so we've seen that as a priority for some of our first projects. And so we've held 2 symposia in our first 2 years of operation in Jerusalem, and it's very important, that it's in Jerusalem and that the organisation centres on Jerusalem. And of course, part of all of that is just that recognition that the Jewish people are indigenous to that land, to that place. I've had the privilege of working with a Professor Emeritus, Professor Wayne Horowitz from Hebrew University, and together we've been able to organise these amazing symposia, and we've gathered some wonderful people to come and speak to these issues. And, we've been addressing our last symposium, we addressed settler colonialism, we addressed the Palestinian historical revisionism, and to be able to bring together experts in the room to talk to those things has been very valuable, because we're building a body of material, and that's so important, especially for our people at our students at university. They need to be able to find sources to back up their point of view. And so this is part of the work that we've been doing. And of course, community building is very important. And that's where you and I have connected. And we've been working with building our network in Canada and other places. And we've just had the wonderful experience of being able to do a number of things in Canada, and that's been very special. Very thankful for that.
Absolutely. For the participants of these symposia and for individuals who you've engaged through your work, you speak to correcting the misinformation and propaganda surrounding colonization and the revisionism of Palestinian leaders as it pertains to Jewish history, which unfortunately we're seeing embraced by even universities and academic institutions across Canada. What has the response been like for you, and especially for First Nations leaders who have been invested and interested in your work? Are they typically surprised to hear this? Is it something that they are also aware of, and they too share this disdain for how history is being revised today to suit a political agenda? What's your experience been like so far?
Well, it's probably helpful if I kind of describe the Indigenous community's response to Israel, to the Jews as Indigenous people, to Zionism, and all these concepts. And I'll speak from my context and as part of the Māori community here. And there's two main responses, of course, and one is very anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and the other is pro. And this anti-Zionist sentiment is quite dominant, and I would have to say this is the reason I really started thinking about this whole area of building a platform for Indigenous supporters of Israel, because I could see how our Indigenous people were being captured by a narrative. And I think I first really started thinking about this in 2016, when we had a Māori politician go to Gaza, join a Gaza flotilla as an Indigenous woman to stand with the Indigenous women of Gaza or Palestine, however she put it. And so to me, this was very concerning. And I had a number of reasons for understanding, the situation, the experiences that I had had up to that point of a number of different experiences. So just to back up and fill that in for you, in the 2000s, my husband and I hosted hundreds of Israelis in our home. And we have a lot of Israelis who come to New Zealand because we're a beautiful country, and I welcome you all to come, but I know Canada's beautiful as well. It's a bit of a competition there. But they come here, and many of the young ones come after their army service. And so we had them in our home, we had meals with them, we had conversations. I fell in love with Israel through these young people. I found them just so admirable, so mature, intelligent, and we just had so many wonderful conversations and really learned about Israel firsthand through these young people and older people as well, of course. And then we did a family trip to Israel in 2008, traveled around Israel for 2 months with 3 of our children, and stayed in the homes of these people that we had hosted. And so we were able to enjoy having meals with them, Shabbat meals. I think we were there over Sukkot, and just a really amazing, authentic experience. And then so there was that kind of background. And then I went back to do postgraduate studies. I started that after raising my family. I've had 4 children. Went back in 2014. And I chose to do as a dissertation the Gaza flotilla raid of 2010. And I examined all the reports around it. And so I could see how this whole false narrative worked, that some of these reports, like the Human Rights Council report, they regurgitate information, they don't base it on solid material. I could see by contrast, the Israeli reports were very thorough, very dense, very serious. New Zealand had a connection to this because a New Zealander, Jeffrey Palmer, led the UN Security Council report. It became known as the Palmer Report. So all of this informed my understanding of the reality of Israel, having met the people, loving them, of course, traveling there on a couple of occasions. I did a Yad Vashem educators course as well in Jerusalem, having studied at university level in detail the information. And so by coming back to this Indigenous woman who went, by 2016, I could see what was happening. I could see it was a false narrative. I could see that our people were being captured by this false narrative. And that was when I began to think about providing the need for a platform for Indigenous supporters of Israel. To really educate and correct the false narrative. And so in New Zealand, this false narrative has developed over decades through activist communities, Māori activist communities who connected with the the International Black Consciousness Movement, for example, the anti-apartheid movement, and this whole Soviet and Arab alliance. Māori connected with that through our own sort of desire for sovereignty and through our own Māori desire to develop, our identity here and to regain our language and all of these things. And so it has actually been in the making for decades through academia and through these activist networks. So that was one side of the Indigenous story here. And I would have to say that's probably the most dominant because it comes through academia and it has, as I said just in the beginning, it has filtered out into politics, into media, and it's sort of adopted unthinkingly. And, that's how propaganda works, as we all know. That's one side of it. The other side of it is the pro-Israel community amongst Māori. And I would have to say it comes from the Christian communities, and it comes from a understanding of the Bible and the connection to Israel. But there is a sort of deeper connection as well, which goes back to our history in the 19th century, where Māori were in that period of colonization, and there were many Māori prophetic leaders who connected with the Israelites, with the stories from the Old Testament or from the Tanakh. And they developed these movements that were based on the Tanakh, and they saw themselves like the Israelites. And so we had a number of Māori prophetic movements that developed. And so that was kind of a philo-Semitic movement, I think you could say. Although I would have to add that the Jewish people were mostly seen symbolically rather than, actual physical flesh and blood. Although there are stories, and one such story is that on the East Coast there was a missionary who was murdered by a Māori tribe, but the Jewish storekeepers' lives were spared because they were part of the Abrahamic race, or, because they were seen as part of the chosen people, so their lives were spared. Fascinating stories in the history. So we have these two different streams amongst our Indigenous people.
Wow, that's very fascinating to hear. I think in the Jewish communities, post-October 7th especially, there were so many videos that were circulating online that went viral from the Maori community. A few that really, I think, got millions and millions of views. I think what I'm referring to, likely. Would you say that they constitute the minority then in New Zealand at this point, and those individuals in those videos, constitute the minority?
For sure, yeah. And they're part of a particular church led by a Māori leader, in this country, and he has churches here and in Australia. So you might have seen some videos coming out of Australia. So they're all of one church called Destiny Church. The leader's Brian Tamaki, and he's very much at the forefront of a movement of, as you started out talking about, standing for Western civilization. I think that's really what he's doing. Many are not comfortable with his methods. He can be quite out there, I suppose. So he's a divisive figure in New Zealand, and I know them. I've met them. They're lovely people. So I think he would be okay with me saying that, because he would agree he is a divisive figure. But people love him or hate him, and he's definitely not loved by the progressive leftist communities in this country. He's very much on the other side of things. But those videos will have come from his people.
Interesting. Okay, good to know. It's very fascinating, Sheree. No matter where you are in the world, and I speak to people in Brazil, in Italy, in Israel, in South America, and everywhere else. And this division between the left and the right is really so incredibly prominent, the world over, where that's where we really believe, rather than being activists in the sense where I am on one side and I am against a person on the other side, our goal is really to engage in conversations and meaningful and respectful dialogue. And you would think actually this is the purpose of countries like New Zealand or Australia and Canada, that people from all backgrounds can come here and respectfully engage, even if they don't agree. Nobody's saying that you need to agree, but it's this sad state of affairs where you hear that people no longer are able to speak with one another due to their political views. And it appears to me you're saying that New Zealand is no stranger to that as well.
Yeah, New Zealand what's happening here is very similar to what's happening in the Western world in general. And I think the experiences of Indigenous in places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and America are similar. Some areas more extreme than others, but a lot of similarities in experience, I think. Mm.
Okay, so that's funny. There's one question I have to ask you just before I forget, because I'm so intrigued, and then I'd like to get back to that, because you mentioned in the 2000s hosting a couple hundred Israelis or so, and I'm curious, was this the first time you met Israeli people? And if not, where did this kind of interest or intrigue, in the Jewish community stem from? Is this something you've always been interested in, or did it kind of happen that day when you met those Israelis?
We had met Israelis prior to that, and it really came out of an awakened desire, I suppose, to learn more from our understanding of the Bible. And my husband and I are Christians, and so it's like we went through this period of our eyes being opened and seeing things we hadn't seen before, and then exploring and finding out, and then we had a whole lot of experiences that have brought us to where we are today, including the fact that when we did our family trip to Israel in 2008, we met Holocaust survivors on a kibbutz that we were staying with, and my husband's a photographer. So we photographed and interviewed them, and that was the beginning of a project today it's called the Holocaust and Anti-Semitism Foundation, Aotearoa New Zealand, and we have interviewed over 70 Holocaust survivors. My husband's produced exhibitions, which we're still showing today in different spaces and places. So it has become an all-encompassing area of life for us, this whole thing. That's really special. I actually didn't know that. Right. Yeah, I did. I actually didn't know that. That's so wonderful. So we talk about Canada, and we talk about what it's like here in Canada, and I'm curious, would you say it's similar in the sense that, yes, we know there are many First Nations leaders who are supportive of Israel here. I've had the pleasure of meeting them and working with them and doing phenomenal campaigns together, and we're also familiar, of course, of those who are anti-Israel. What's your experience been like navigating the space in Canada?
Have you found that there is any nuance, or that it's still very much individuals falling into one camp or another?
I think it's similar from what I gather, and you have some wonderful, remarkable First Nations people over there, leaders, people like Harry Laforme and Karen Restel. Karen Restel spoke at our first conference. She did a phenomenal presentation. It had to be by Zoom, unfortunately, but it was wonderful. And then, of course, some of the chiefs, like the former Grand Chief Linda Prince and Grand Chief Harvey Yesno, who's wonderful, of course, Melody, Grey Eyes. So you've got you do have some amazing First Nations people there who are willing to speak up and be public. And this is the thing that a lot of Indigenous people, they may sort of agree, but you've got to go to that next step, to that next level, and put their neck on the line, as it were. There has to be quite a strong conviction. And I find that there are usually 2 or 3 reasons that push Indigenous people to that level of conviction. And one is if they are a Christian and they have a Christian faith, and they come from that perspective. The other is, and I've seen this more in Canada, I've seen it in Australia, where there has been a relationship that has developed where the Jewish people have really made an impact on their Indigenous communities. And you may have heard of Nova Perez. Nova came to our last symposium and gave a wonderful speech. And she talks about how the Jewish people stood with them in their fight for recognition. And the Mabo case is a famous case, and they had many Jewish lawyers who were advocating for them there. And so that's the other one. And the other one is just a very strong humanitarian kind of a sentiment, and usually a combination. So the combination of that relationship plus a humanitarianism pushes or motivates some Indigenous leaders to put their heads up and speak up. But it comes at a great cost. And I know for Nova, for example, that she has had a lot of hate, and you become marginalised, you become pushed to one side. We had recently a Māori delegation that went to Israel, and it's quite an interesting story. It was led by an Israeli woman who's lived here for 20 years. She's a citizen of New Zealand, so she has New Zealand children. And she had developed relationships in the Māori community through her work and health and what have you. And so some of these Māori leaders grew to trust her and love her. Again, this is the relationship thing happening. Yeah. And so at the beginning of last year, she put out this idea because there was an opportunity, to be able to fund a group to go. So she put out the idea to these Māori leaders. And for them, it was a really kind of huge thing to try and bring together a Māori group to go to Israel because of the backlash that they would get from their families and their communities. Thankfully, it came together. It was a struggle. I know it was hard work to get this group together. And the majority of them were not pro-Israel. They were either anti or sitting on the fence. But even just to get them there was a big struggle. But it opened their eyes. It turned them around. They saw the reality. And I think there's nothing better than taking people to Israel.
I agree.
Yeah, and for Māori, and I think it's similar with most Indigenous people, we're heart people, and, their hearts connected with the stories of the Israelis. One of the things they were amazed with, and of course this is just normal if you live in Israel, you don't think twice about it, but they were just amazed to see the Arab bus driver on their tour and the Jewish tour guide and Ifat. They only met when they got there, but they were like best buddies, and to see them operating each day, that spoke volumes to this group because they'd been indoctrinated with this view of apartheid, so it was very, very powerful. And we really hope as an Indigenous embassy to be able to replicate that, around the world, to take these Indigenous groups to Israel. So important.
God willing, Bezat Hashem. I think many professionals in this space have always recognized the most effective, but yet costly way to show the falsehood of this notion of apartheid, show the falsehood of this notion of systemic racism within Israel, is simply to bring people to Israel. You don't even need to leave the airport, right, to see the Muslims and Jews and Christians working together, coexisting together peacefully. I might add, with our organization, obviously we lead trips to Israel twice a year. We actually just came back a couple of days ago. And we had, students of various backgrounds as well. And it's always, I think, a shock to them, to students. We had a student now who was a Chinese Canadian and a student who was an Indian Canadian, and was, he's heard about this and they've heard about this from their Jewish friends or whatever, but it's still, I don't think, ever can prepare them, right, for the slap across the face, that is Israeli diversity and coexistence, especially when you see it as being so unique to the Middle East, right? And now, thank God, we see more and more, coexistence and partnership in places like UAE and Bahrain and Azerbaijan and other places. But there's obviously so much, room still for us to grow. So I'm curious, because that sounds like such a phenomenal experience, and I'm curious from your perspective, especially as a Maori woman, what connection then do you see between the Jewish people and First Nations people, and specifically the Maori people? Because you mentioned obviously that there's the connection and the Christianity. Is there also this understanding, once the awareness has come up, that the Jewish people also have this very strong connection to a land, and that many would argue, and we certainly do, that the Jewish people are indigenous to a land because of the relationships they've maintained with nation, religion, culture, language, right, that we have maintained for millennia. Is that something you'd see that's very obvious to the Maoris that attended this trip, but also First Nations individuals in general?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are two main parts to that, the whole indigeneity question, and you've got all these criteria, but the one is peoplehood and the other is land and the development of a people in the land. And I think perhaps this is why many, and particularly Western nations, struggle with the idea of Jews being indigenous, because they have this more individualistic way of seeing the world. Or a Jewish person, for example, may struggle themselves to see themselves as indigenous people, because they live within this worldview of being an individual. But I think we have to grasp peoplehood, and for Māori, we are a people. Israel are a people for millennia, that history. And so it's the peoplehood and the connection of a people with a particular land. And of course, Israel, continuous connection for more than 3,000 years, maybe 4,000 years, and the development of your culture in connection to that land. It's so special and so unique. When you look at Jewish culture, you look at these festivals and feasts, and it's all it's connected to your history in that land. These are all the evidences that the Jews are the indigenous people of that land. And it's not about being the first in that land. It's about the land within which your culture developed, your peoplehood developed, your language developed. And I think for Indigenous people, it's quite easy to see that, actually. We look at the Jewish people and we see they're tribal like us. Their tribes descend from their ancestors, just like ours do. Our tribes, we have an ancestor, an eponymous ancestor, and, our tribes have come from that. And so these similarities are so obvious. It's so easy, I think, for Indigenous people to see those similarities if they haven't been brainwashed just to see Jews as white Europeans. Once they actually understand the history, we have a concept here called Māoridin called ahika, which means keeping the fires burning. And so for Māori to hold or keep sovereignty or over a piece of land, you live on that land, and you occupy that land. It's called keeping the fires burning. And so the fact that the Jewish people have had a presence in the land, a continuous presence in the land, even though they've been dispersed, even though they've been in exile, they've always been Jewish people there. for us, that's the Jewish people keeping ahika over that land, keeping sovereignty over that land, keeping the fires burning. So there are all these different ways of seeing that from an Indigenous perspective. It just totally makes sense that the Jews are the Indigenous people of that land.
Yes.
And I think one of the other oppositions that come is around particularity versus a universalization or universalism. And so some people struggle with the particularity of it, but that is being tribal, that is being Indigenous. We are a particular people in a particular land, and it comes with the territory. And so that's a struggle for some people to get their heads around, but that's being Indigenous is what I say.
That's incredible. And I think it's a shame that it's something, I think, within our own community that we didn't quite understand. And, you know, if you look at the collective and shared traumas of Jewish people, especially post-World War II and post the Holocaust, I get why so many of them they tried to make Judaism sound as simple as possible. And they said, oh, yes, you know, it's just a religion, just like Christianity and Islam, you know, anything kind of for them to be able to assimilate, you know, and not turn too many heads. And I think now, this past decade, especially in the midst of rising anti-Semitism and rising anti-Israel sentiment, that many members of our community are recognizing this importance of not just even identifying that we are indigenous to Israel, but why we are indigenous to Israel, right? Because I think when you ask even like the most secular Jew, you know, for how long did we say next year at Jerusalem at the Pesach Seder? Why is every single synagogue built facing towards Jerusalem? Why is, as you mentioned, the calendar based on Israel, right? Like you know, now it's supposed to be the holiday coming up, you know, it's going to be the holiday of the trees, right? But that'll happen during wintertime in Toronto. So then why are we as Jewish people, right, celebrating something while it's still winter, you know, because it's not happening here, it's happening there. And I think when Jewish people recognize that, you know, that they have this aha moment, right? Especially we've brought students, for example, to Rome to be able to see the Arch of Titus, right? To see archaeological evidence that corroborates that the Jews come from this land, and that there's literal carbon dated evidence built in 71 CE, right? That shows the Romans carrying away the spoils of Jerusalem after they destroyed the Second Temple. Would you say that when you have these type of conversations with other First Nations leaders, that they have this kind of aha moment as well when they're hearing it from that perspective, or as you said, does it depend on the person overwhelmingly?
Yeah, I think the aha moments are there, and I can think of an example, actually.
I'd love for you to share a positive, you know, or negative you can as well, but I'd love to hear the positive.
So we have been really trying to get into Māori spaces that we're called marae. That's where Māori gather for meetings. We call them hui. And we were at a hui on a marae last year, and one of our Māori friends who is a supporter and a lover of Israel, he's also a Christian, he did this, we call it whakapapa, it's genealogy from the Old Testament to Jesus, so from Abraham to Jesus, and he quoted it all by memory and built in the little stories on the way, and he did this little presentation. Now for Māori, this is hugely impacting because genealogy or whakapapa is a very central part of Māori thinking, Māori epistemology. Māori see everything in terms of relationships, whakapapa, genealogy, who comes from who, and you know how it spreads out. And so for this Māori leader to quote this genealogy from the Tanakh and present it to people, it was like, oh, yeah, these people are, you know, these people are indigenous. They have genealogy, they have whakapapa, just like we do. So, you know, there are all these kinds of things that happen those are the aha moments. But I think, you know, this delegation that went to Israel, I think for them, it was their hearts connecting with the people. And for me as well, actually, when I was hosting all these Israelis, it was my heart connecting with the people. And Jewish people are very much like us. You know, they love family. The relationship is important. They love food. These sorts of things, bring us together. But I could see that that's what happened in Israel, is that they connected with the people and their hearts were captured. And that's a big part of it, I think, is that heart capture.
That's really, really worthwhile to know. I think, unfortunately, the anti-Israel movement is very strong, and anti-Jewish haters are a dime a dozen. And truthfully, I think it's very obvious, actually, that anti-Semitism is just for the weak, that need a scapegoat, that need a reason to blame their problems. The majority of anti-Semites have never even met a Jewish person. There's only 15 million Jews in the world. It's impossible for every anti-Semite to meet a Jewish person. And that's the point, right? That the Jew is a simple, it's a demon, it's a parasite, it's a scapegoat in that person's head, right? It's not a person they've actually met and known, right? It's the idea of the Jew. And that's what makes it so easy for this poison to spread in that way. And I think that pertains as well to this notion that you have anti-Semites from the right saying that we have to go back to Israel, where you have anti-Semites from the left saying that we have to go back to Poland, right? And a lot of misinformation and disinformation, actually, I would say, comes from that. So I love to hear what you have to say about genealogy specifically, because I've done my ancestry DNA as an example, right? And for our line of Jewish people, historians agree that we are the Jews of Babylon that left Israel 600 years before Jesus Christ was even born. And my DNA shows more than 22% Levant, Israel, right? And then 60% Persia, where my family was exiled after we were exiled from the Levant, from Israel, into the Persian area, which then eventually we ended up in Central Asia, and then I have another 20% of Central Asia. But my DNA, right, corroborates what the historians have said, what the Jewish people have maintained, that we came from this land. And I wonder if you've come across this in your work. When I meet anti-Israel activists or Palestinians who will say to me, oh, but the Palestinians are indigenous to Palestine because of our skin color, I'll ask them, if you moved to Europe and if you maintained your language, maintained your religion, maintained your culture, maintained your tradition, maintained your relationship to the land of Palestine, and over 1,000 years your skin became lighter, but that you still maintained every single aspect of your peoplehood, are you still Palestinian? And they will say to me, yes. And I will say, okay, great. That's what it is to be Jewish. That's what it is to be Ashkenazi. Have you come across, those conversations as well? Especially as it comes to the misinformation that people are trying to spread, about Jewish people and our connection to Israel. Mm-hmm. And when you have, what's your answer to that?
Look, I think what I'd have to say is that there are not many actual conversations being had. There's a big propaganda machine, and the propaganda is that Jews are white, even though you and I know that the majority of Israelis are not white.
Absolutely.
But there's this propaganda machine that pumps out the lies, and the majority of people in my community just buy it. They just buy the lie, and I think it's just that greater dynamic that's going on about, in order to be acceptable, you've got to be pro-Palestinian, you've got to be an environmentalist, there's all these kind of progressive causes that most people actually don't know the details about, yes. But they just buy the propaganda lie. And that's the sad reality, really, of it. Yeah.
Yes. I think we're seeing that, especially now in the wake of Somaliland being recognized by Israel, in the wake of the protests we're seeing in Iran, in the wake of Maduro in Venezuela. I think all of this is coming up in that same way, that these people, whatever side they're on, are not thinking critically and simply subscribing to their side, whatever their side tells them, right? There's, because I think Venezuela especially showed that for all these people who hate Trump, they didn't stop to think for a second that maybe this might have been helpful to the people of Venezuela, right? Regardless of what your politics are. Because I would never say, oh, you should support Trump now because of what he did. Absolutely not. But can you look at this critically, right, while disliking him, but also being able to understand that, oh, maybe there was something to this, right? Mm-hmm. I'll ask you because I'd want to leave everybody off with a positive story instead. And I'm curious, for someone who's been doing this work, and I didn't realize actually for how long you've been doing it, and it's truly incredible, Sheree. What would you say gives you hope as someone who's been doing this work? And what do you think people need to understand more? If there was one thing that they can understand more about your work and the work of Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem, what would that one thing be?
Well, what gives me hope is that I can see hearts and minds changing, like this delegation going to Israel, and that is so powerful. And that's the first thing. And what was the second question again? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. And the second question would be, if there's one thing you could say that you'd want people to better understand about the work that you're doing with Indigenous Embassy of Jerusalem, especially, what would that be?
Well, I think we're at a critical moment, and I can see that this is a time where we really need to rise up, stand up, and push back against these false narratives. That's what we're seeking to do. That's one of our main priorities, is to change the narrative, and we're doing that through all the work that we're involved with the holding symposia, building a body of material. And so that's where we're putting a lot of our effort and energy at the moment, is changing the narrative and educating our people, through providing this body of material so it can filter out to our communities and change hearts and minds.
Bezat Hashem. And I think actually a last question that occurred to me, just in case anybody has a question about it. I think when we use the word in embassy, it's usually used in a very, of official sense, as the embassy of a specific country. Was there a specific and strategic reason for why the Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem has embassy in its name that way? Is it meant to serve as an embassy for all First Nations leaders from around the world?
Absolutely, yeah. And the desire for an embassy has been amongst the Indigenous people for decades, actually. And from our Canadian friends, we've heard the story of going to Israel in 1999 and asking for an embassy. So an embassy is a platform, it's a mechanism, it is a way of being able to provide a platform for all Indigenous people across the globe. And we are looking to establish a base in Jerusalem. It's still a work in progress, but that is our eventual goal, that we will have a place in Jerusalem that the Indigenous people can come to, and it's their own little footprint in the land where they can, feel that they're a part of this amazing country of Israel.
Bezat Hashem. Bezat Hashem. Dr. Sheree Trotter, thank you so much for being with us here. I think this is so fascinating. And anyone who's listening, I really encourage you to visit Indigenous Embassy Jerusalem. They're very active on Instagram. Their website's fantastic. You'll see a few of the collaborative initiatives that we've done there as well. And thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks, Daniel. Great to talk to you again.
Always a pleasure. Okay, and I have to ask you also, these delegations to Israel, and the Māori one you just mentioned, if you're ever planning on doing one again, I would love if we could try to sync it up for when we're bringing a delegation of students, right? Because to be able to introduce those students, to these First Nations leaders, and mind you, if even if some of them are critical, just to be able to hear from them, hey, what's your experience been like? What have you learned? What have you seen? I think that could be so impactful. Do you know if you're planning on doing something like that again?
Well, it's a goal at this stage. So there's a lot of work, to bring it together. And we're still very much in the beginning stages, but it's definitely one of the things that we will be looking to do eventually in time.
Okay. So that's time. Keep me posted, because I think,
yeah,
I think it's something where I need to be reminding, Grand Chief Harvey or Grand Chief Linda, because I feel like they all want to come to Israel all the time anyway. So I either need to remind them, or I even need to kind of figure out a way strategically where we can ensure that even we are bringing them to Israel. Because I think for a group of Canadian students, especially, to be able to hear from them while they're in Israel, and gain that knowledge, and also especially gain the understanding of the challenges that that Harry's community is going through, that Grand Chief Harvey's community is going through. He's spoken so much to the challenges that his community faces, and they're real. These are real problems, right? And I think something that I don't want to do a disservice, but I feel like there's more that I'd like to do in terms of supporting their community, right? I visited Harry's house a couple of months ago. I should have had this on the podcast, but he gave me
lovely
this, right? And what was it? It's sweetgrass, tobacco, cedar and sage, right? The people's medicines, right? So I think I think there's so much that people don't know about First Nations communities, and especially hospitality. Right, is like such
it's important,
a pillar, right? It's funny because that day when you guys came, anytime anyone comes to our office, I want to make sure that they're leaving with something, right? But I didn't even realize, how important it would be after you had visited the embassy. Because remember, I think Grand Chief Harvey was annoyed a little bit, that he had visited the embassy and there wasn't any exchange of gifts, right? And he taught me so, and then Harry Laforme taught me so much more about that when I visited him and Janice, because they explained the importance of gift giving. They explained like those, the importance of all that, right? So it's very funny because I feel like I learned so much about it, and there's still, I think, so much more that our community, that the Jewish community can do to support, these communities. Like I don't feel like we're still at a place where we are. Like if Harvey, were to say to me, hey, because he's mentioned how there's a lack of clean drinking water, I've said to him, put me to work. Like, how can I get, donors of mine to help? How can we get the Jewish community to help? And it's funny because he hasn't ever quite given me anything tangible. If you ever hear of ways that we could support our campaigns, like, I really believe allyship is a two-way street. And I'm so grateful for the work that you do, and Grand Chief Linda and Grand Chief Harvey and Harry and everyone else. But sometimes I feel like, wow, like I want any allied community to recognize that we're here for you as well, and often I feel like they're not making those asks. I think they're so focused on combating the anti-Israel propaganda with us that they're not interested in asking any more of us, that they want us to focus on that. And I think as Christians especially, that's so important to them. But I just want them to understand too that we need to reciprocate, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it could be that that it's tricky within a tribe. The majority of tribes will be anti-Israel, so then you would have that job of trying to persuade your people to connect with Israel, and he's not currently a chief. So that could be part of the certainly it's the challenge here. There's a lot of ways that Israel could be helping our communities, and they are actually. We do have some wonderful around our geothermal areas. They're using Israeli technology. Tends to go under the radar, though. It's not something that they would. I don't feel like
I've seen that. Is there anything that speaks to that? I would love to elevate that if we're.
I'll find some things that show the Israeli kind of.
Please. Yeah. That's the type of stuff that on both our Instagram accounts, I think people would really appreciate.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.